There is a sound the frontier makes when it is trying to kill you. It is not a roar, it is not a scream. It is something slower and more patient than that. A low, grinding patience that seeps through the walls of a colony module at 3 in the morning, through the thermal insulation and the double-sealed bulkheads, through the sleeping bag pulled tight around your shoulders, until it settles somewhere behind your sternum and just sits there, like a debt you owe the universe, like a promise the universe made to you before you were born and intends to keep. Caleb Marsh knew that sound the way he knew the calluses on his own hands. He had been on Varath's crossing for 4 years, 2 months and 11 days. He knew because he counted, not obsessively. He was not the kind of man who scratched marks into walls or kept a paper diary or lay awake rehearsing the number. He counted the way a farmer counts seasons or a sailor counts tides, because on a world like Varath's crossing, knowing where you stood in time was a form of survival. The planet did not care how long you had been there. The planet did not grant experience points or offer discounts on its hostility, but it helped to know. It helped to know that you were still here after 4 years, that the cold and the quake tremors and the chemical-laced soil and the 300 days of overcast sky had not in fact finished the job. The Varath crossing colony, officially designated New Harbour View Settlement 7, which nobody called it, sat in the low basin between 2 ridgelines of sedimentary rock, on the 4th planet of the Varath system, some 83 light-years from the nearest major human population center. The Varath system had been surveyed by the Colonial Mapping Initiative 6 years earlier. The survey report had listed the 4th planet as marginally habitable, with a note about the soil's sulfur compounds and a recommendation for subterranean agricultural modules. It had also noted the presence of indigenous fauna, several dozen species, none of them sapient according to standard neurological assessments, none of them demonstrably dangerous at settlement scale. The survey had been right about most of that. It had been spectacularly wrong about one thing. The Korathi were not in the survey report. They were not in the survey report because they did not live in the areas the survey teams had mapped. They lived in the deep ridge country to the north, in networks of tunnels and chambers that the orbital mapping had read as geological formations. They were small. They were quiet. They communicated in a frequency range that standard survey equipment logged as ambient mineral static, and they were, by any reasonable definition of the word, sapient. The colonial authority had revised the planet's classification 17 months after the first settler ships touched down. By then, New Harbour View Settlement 7 already existed. By then, 814 humans had already built their lives around the sulfur-filtered water processors and the subterranean grow blocks and the wind turbines anchored into the eastern ridge. By then it was complicated. The authorities' revised assessment designated Varath's crossing as a shared habitation zone, a classification that generated approximately 10,000 documents of regulatory guidance, 17 committees, 2 ambassadorial task forces, and 1 genuine, lasting, quietly ferocious headache for every human being who lived there. Caleb Marsh had read most of the regulatory guidance. He had ignored most of the committees. And the headache, well, that was just part of the sound the frontier made. He was 38 years old. He had come to Varath's crossing with his wife Sarah, and the plan they had spent 4 years building back on Meridian Station, a plan for a hydroponics cooperative, for a life off the transit lanes, for something real and solid and theirs. Sarah had been the dreamer of the two of them. Caleb had been the one who knew how to weld. Sarah had died in the second-year quakes, a structural failure in Module 4. She had been helping reinforce the eastern wall supports at the time, because that was the kind of person she was, always reinforcing things, always making sure the structure held. The seismic event had lasted 11 seconds. The wall had held. Sarah had not. Caleb had stayed. He had asked himself many times in the dark hours before the colony's artificial dawn cycle kicked in and the thermal heaters began to tick and groan, why he had stayed. He was not sentimental. He did not keep Sarah's things as shrine objects or talk to her photograph. He was a practical man in almost every way, and the practical answer was that he had nowhere better to go. Meridian Station held nothing for him now. His family was scattered. His friends from before were in a life he no longer fit. And there was the other thing, the thing he did not talk about with the colony administrator, or the settlement psychologist, or the two friends he'd made in 4 years, Dominic, who ran the water processing unit, and old Farah, who had somehow lived through 6 frontier placements and retained a capacity for humor that Caleb considered borderline pathological. The thing he did not talk about was that when Sarah died, Caleb Marsh had decided, quietly and without drama, that he was going to earn this planet. He was going to stay until it was his, not in a legal sense, not in any documented, surveyed, certified sense, but in the way that a scar is yours, and the years you spent climbing back from grief are yours, and the ugly, difficult knowledge you carry from surviving something unsurvivable is yours. He was going to stay until he understood this place. He almost had. And then, on a cold morning in the 308th day of his 4th year on Verith's crossing, everything he thought he understood shifted by about 40 degrees. That was the morning he found the egg. The Eastern Ridge Path was not technically authorized for solo foot travel before the second bell of the colony's morning cycle. Caleb went anyway. He always went anyway. He had a standing arrangement with Farah, who ran the gate log, and Farah had a standing policy of creative data entry. He brought her extra thermal ration packs. It was a mutually agreeable system. The ridge path was the closest thing Varath's crossing had to beauty. The sedimentary rock had been laid down over millions of years in rust orange and pale cream strata, and the way the early light caught it, the colony's automated dawn lighting blended with the faint, greenish light that filtered through the overcast from Varath's primary star, produced something that was almost warm. The rock absorbed the overnight cold slowly and released it through the morning hours in a barely perceptible breath, and if you put your hand flat against the stone in the right place, at the right time, you could feel the planet exhaling. Caleb put his hand against the rock most mornings. He could not have explained why. He did it the way some people pray, not out of expectation, but out of the habit of reaching towards something larger than yourself. That morning, the rock was different, not dramatically different, not in a way that would have registered on any sensor, but Caleb had been walking this path for 4 years, and his body had memorized its rhythms the way a musician memorizes a melody, not note by note, but as a whole shape. Something in the shape had changed. He stopped. He stood still for a long moment, listening. The wind off the ridge was the same, a low, scraping whisper through the rock channels, carrying the faint mineral smell that he had long since stopped noticing consciously. The temperature was the same. The light was the same. Then he heard it, not a sound he had a name for, not any animal call he had catalogued in 4 years of walking this path. It was a frequency that seemed to arrive more in his teeth than in his ears, a thin, sustained vibration, like a crystal glass being rubbed along its rim, but so faint and irregular that you could have convinced yourself it was the wind if you had not been standing perfectly still with your hand against the rock. He followed it. The path here was narrow, and twice he had to press himself against the cliff face to move through a section where the rock jutted out over a 20-meter drop to the basin below. He moved with the practiced ease of someone who had done this enough times to stop being careful and start being competent. His boots found the footholds without looking. His hands found the handholds by memory. The sound was coming from a shelf of rock about 6 meters below the path, accessible via a crevice that widened just enough to permit a careful descent. He descended. The shelf was about 2 meters wide and 4 meters deep, sheltered from above by an overhang that caught and held the warmth off the rock face. It would have been invisible from the path, from the air, from any standard sweep. It was the kind of place that existed because the geological record had created it over millions of years without any particular purpose, and which therefore became, by accident, the perfect kind of shelter for something that needed to be hidden. The egg was set into a natural depression in the back of the shelf. It was approximately the size of a human infant, which Caleb would later learn was not a coincidence. Charathi eggs were proportioned according to the adult size, and a Charathi adult was roughly child-sized by human standards. The shell was not smooth. It was faceted in the way of certain crystals, each facet covered in a membrane that pulsed with the faint bioluminescence that Charathi used for communication in their underground chambers. In the cold morning air of the shelf, the pulses were slow and irregular. The vibration was coming from inside. Caleb crouched down next to it. He did not touch it. He had been on Vereth's crossing long enough to know that you did not touch things until you understood what you were touching. He reached into his jacket pocket and activated his field communicator, running a passive scan. The scan told him 3 things. The first thing was that the egg was alive, metabolically active, with a heat signature substantially below ambient. This was, apparently, not good. He did not know that yet, but he would. The second thing was that the egg was alone. No Charathi signatures in the immediate area. No tunnel openings within 50 meters. Whatever had laid this egg here, it was not here now. The third thing was that his field communicator was 17 months out of date on Charathi biological data, and was therefore hedging all of its analysis with asterisks and uncertainty flags. He sat back on his heels and looked at the egg for a long time. The vibration had changed slightly since he'd arrived. It was less regular now, more fragmented. It reminded him of something, in a way he could not immediately locate. Then he located it. It reminded him of the noise his field radio made when the battery was failing. That last, irregular series of signals, each one a little weaker than the one before. Something was wrong. He pulled off his outer jacket, the heavy thermal layer, rated to -40, and very carefully, moving slowly in the way you move around things that might startle, he wrapped it around the egg. He held it for a moment, feeling the faceted surface against his palms. The irregular vibrations ran up through his hands and into his wrists. He said out loud to an egg on a rock shelf at 300 meters elevation, in the cold green light of a distant star, "All right, I've got you." He said it the way he had once said it to a failing water pump at 2 in the morning during the first winter, the way he had once said it to a ceiling strut that was pulling away from its anchor point while he worked to resecure it alone. He said it the way a person says something when they are the only one available to say it, and the alternative is to say nothing. Then he began the careful climb back up the crevice, one-handed, with his jacket wrapped around an alien egg held against his chest. He would later tell Farah that he had not made a decision in that moment. He would tell her that there was no decision to make, because the thing in front of him was alive and needed help, and those 2 facts were sufficient. Farah would look at him for a long moment and then say, "Caleb, honey, that is the most decision-containing thing a person can say." He would not have a good answer for that. He rarely did. The colony medical unit was run by a woman named Dr. Adeze Okonkwo, who had come to Vereth's Crossing under circumstances she rarely discussed and had stayed for reasons she discussed even less. She was brilliant, meticulous, and possessed of a professional skepticism that Caleb had always appreciated, particularly in a doctor. She was also one of the few people in the colony who had completed supplementary xenobiological training because the colonial authorities' regulation updates had required medical personnel in shared habitation zones to do so, and Adeze Okonkwo was not the kind of person who left regulatory requirements unmet. She was therefore the correct person to call. She was also, at this particular moment, extremely unhappy. "I want to be clear," she said, standing over the examination table on which Caleb had placed the egg, still wrapped in his jacket, "that what you have done is not straightforwardly legal." "I haven't done anything yet," Caleb said. "I found it. I brought it here. That's it." The shared habitation protocols specify that any Charathi biological material or living specimen encountered outside designated interaction zones must be reported to the zone liaison before physical contact is established. It was dying. "You didn't know that." "I know what dying sounds like." Adase looked at him, then she looked at the egg. The jacket had fallen partially away, and the bioluminescent pulses from the shell surface were visible in the dim lighting of the medical unit, slow, arrhythmic, fading. She picked up her scanner. "The thermal signature is critically low," she said after a moment. "The developmental membrane is degrading on the ventral facets." She moved the scanner. "The interior atmosphere, the egg maintains an internal gas composition. It's destabilizing. The carbon dioxide content is too high." She set the scanner down. "How long ago did you find it?" 40 minutes. "It's been in low thermal conditions since before that. Based on the degradation pattern, a minimum of 8 hours, possibly as many as 14. She picked up the scanner again. Chorathy eggs require specific thermal cycling to maintain development. They cannot survive extended cold exposure. The shell is designed to hold heat for a limited emergency period, but that period has been exceeded." Caleb looked at her. "Can you help it?" "I don't know." She was already moving. "I know the basic requirements from the updated xenobiological protocols. I have the supplementary manual. I have not treated a Chorathy egg before, because no one has, because we are not in the habit of bringing them into the medical unit." She pulled a thermal regulation unit from the equipment locker. "But the biology is not entirely dissimilar from certain reptile species I have treated, and the protocols give temperature and atmospheric parameters." "Then you're going to try." "I am a doctor," Adiza said, in a tone that made further commentary unnecessary. Caleb stood back and watched. He watched for 6 hours. He was not a man who was comfortable with watching. His hands wanted to be useful. He found a shelf of equipment that needed reorganizing and reorganized it. He found a diagnostic relay that was running slightly warm and traced the cause to a loose connection and fixed it. He made 3 rounds of the medical unit's outer corridor and returned each time to find Adiza still working, still methodical, the egg now resting in an improvised thermal cradle she had constructed from 2 heating units and a reflective medical blanket, the atmospheric composition of its immediate environment being carefully managed with a gas metering device from the unit's pulmonary cabinet. At hour 6, the bioluminescent pulses steadied, not dramatically, not in any cinematic way. The pulses did not suddenly bloom into brilliant color or begin a clear rhythmic pattern. They just became slightly less erratic. They became slightly more regular, like a heartbeat finding its footing. Adiza made a sound that was not quite relief and not quite satisfaction, but occupied the narrow territory between them. "It's stable," she said. "For now, it's not out of danger, but it's not actively dying." Caleb let out a breath he had been holding. He realized, for about 6 hours, "I need to file a report," Adiza said. "The zone liaison needs to know immediately. The Chorathy Interaction Office needs to be contacted. We need to find out where this egg came from." "Yes, and Caleb." She turned to look at him directly. "You understand that the expected outcome of this is that the Chorathy community it belongs to will be identified and the egg will be returned." "I understand." "And that your involvement will be noted." "I understand that too." She looked at him a moment longer. "You don't look like someone who understands the implications." "Adiza," he said, "I pulled it off a ledge in the middle of nowhere, and it was 14 hours past due on temperature. I don't need it to be complicated. I just needed it to be alive." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, more quietly, "So did I." The report was filed. The zone liaison, a young man named Petir, who had been in the position for 5 months, and had the specific variety of anxiety that came from trying to apply colonial regulatory frameworks to situations no one had quite anticipated, arrived within 20 minutes. The Chorathy Interaction Office, based in a communications relay station 40 kilometers from the colony, was contacted by secure channel, and here was the first complication. The Chorathy Interaction Office did not know whose egg it was. This was, according to the xenobiological specialist on the channel, a woman named Dr. Haverith, who had spent 3 years studying Chorathy social structures from the polite distance that the Interaction Office maintained, unprecedented. Chorathy communal structures were tight, interlocking, and defined by biological signal networks. Eggs were not lost. Eggs were not abandoned. Eggs were not left on rock shelves 8 hours from any known Charathi habitation zone for 14 hours below survivable temperature. There are two possible explanations, Dr. Haverith said, her voice slightly flattened by the relay compression. One is that this is an administrative anomaly we are not currently equipped to interpret. The other is that the egg was abandoned intentionally. The silence that followed was of the kind that has weight. That happens? Petir asked. It is rare. It is not unknown. Dr. Haverith paused. Charathi eggs that are identified as non-viable through developmental signaling are sometimes removed from the communal incubation space. The communal resources available for incubation are not unlimited. If a developing chick is assessed as non-viable, the colony may make a decision to leave it, Caleb said. Yes, another silence. But it's not non-viable, Caleb said. It was in thermal distress, but the development is intact. Dr. Okonkwo's assessment confirms that. The Charathi assessment methodology is different from ours, Dr. Haverith said carefully. They assess viability through signal monitoring. If the egg's bioluminescent signal output fell below community threshold parameters, they may have determined it was non-viable based on incomplete or misread data, particularly if the temperature drop began before they completed their assessment. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief. It was closer to recognition. He had a name for it from his own life, but this was not the moment. So the egg was abandoned based on a bad read, he said. It is possible. And what happens now? With respect to the regulatory protocol, we will initiate contact with the nearest Charathi community through standard signal exchange. We will convey the egg's status. We will await a response. Dr. Haverith paused again. Response times through signal exchange can be variable. The Charathi do not communicate on schedules we have successfully mapped. How long? Days, possibly weeks. Caleb looked at the thermal cradle. The pulses were still steady. And in the meantime, he said. In the meantime, Dr. Haverith said, the egg requires continuous environmental management. Dr. Okonkwo's initial intervention was correct, but it cannot be maintained without expertise. I can transmit detailed care protocols, but someone will need to monitor and manage the environment continuously. I'll do it, Caleb said. Petir opened his mouth. I found it, Caleb said. I've got the time, and I'll learn whatever I need to learn. He looked at Adeze with supervision. Adeze looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the egg. Then she said, I will maintain medical oversight. Caleb will be briefed on the protocols and can handle the day-to-day management under my direction. Petir made several sounds that were not quite objections. They died in the face of two people who had already made up their minds. That night, Caleb moved a cot into the medical unit's side room and slept 3 meters from an alien egg in a thermal cradle, listening to the faint vibration of its bioluminescent pulses, which had, by midnight, settled into something that was almost rhythmic, almost like breathing. He put his hand on the thermal cradle's external surface once, before he slept. He did not know why. It was the same gesture as putting your hand on the rock, reaching towards something larger than yourself. He said nothing this time. He did not need to. The protocols Dr. Haverith transmitted were 47 pages long and written in the particular style of regulatory science documents, precise to the point of obscurity, comprehensive to the point of redundancy, and organized according to a logic that seemed designed to punish casual reading. Caleb read them 3 times in the first night. By the third reading, he had stopped skimming and started annotating. He was not a scientist. He was a man who knew how to learn practical things because he had spent his entire adult life in environments where not learning was not an option. He had learned hydroponic soil chemistry in the months before leaving Meridian Station. He had learned colonial structural engineering in his first year on Verith's Crossing, mostly by making mistakes in controlled environments before the stakes became real. He had learned seismic monitoring protocols after the second-year quakes, because the quakes had a way of focusing attention. He learned Chorathi developmental biology the same way he learned everything, by deciding it was necessary and then refusing to stop until it was done. The core of it, as he understood it, Chorathi eggs functioned as semi-autonomous developmental environments. The shell was not passive. It regulated temperature, gas composition and humidity through a biological mechanism, the faceted membranes, which opened and closed in response to environmental conditions, drawing in or releasing gases in calculated micro-exchanges. The bioluminescent pulses were not just communication, they were also a kind of metabolic indicator. The frequency, intensity and pattern of the pulses conveyed information about the developmental state inside. The egg had been failing not because of any fundamental developmental problem, but because the thermal drop had suppressed the membrane activity below functional threshold. The shell had been trying to regulate itself and failing. It was like watching someone try to breathe with the muscles half frozen. The thermal cradle Adase had improvised was working, but imperfectly. The temperature was stable, but the cycling was wrong. Chorathi eggs needed not a constant temperature but a specific thermal rhythm, a slow oscillation through a range of about 8 degrees over a 12-hour period, mimicking the natural thermal variation of the deep ridge chambers where Chorathi eggs normally incubated. Caleb spent the second day redesigning the thermal cradle. He used components from the medical unit's equipment room, a salvaged heating element from the colony's maintenance stores that Dominic pulled for him without asking too many questions, and a timing relay he built himself from a circuit kit that had been sitting in his supply locker since year 2. He programmed the thermal cycle from the protocol specifications, verified it against Adase's scanner readings, and watched for 2 hours to confirm it was behaving as designed. The third day, the bioluminescent pulses changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would have shown up clearly on most monitoring equipment. But Caleb had been sitting with this egg for 72 hours by then, and he knew its patterns the way you know a particular piece of music after you have heard it enough times, not as a sequence of notes but as a shape, a whole. The pulses in the new thermal rhythm were not just steadier, they were layered. There was the primary pulse, the overall metabolic indicator, and there were secondary pulses now, smaller and faster, running between the primary ones, like harmonics. He called Adase. She scanned it and was quiet for a long moment. That is consistent with secondary developmental activation, she said. According to the protocol documentation, this happens when the primary developmental systems have stabilized and the organism begins the next phase. The secondary pulses are the developmental scaffolding for neural architecture. Neura, Caleb said. Yes. She looked at him. The egg is beginning to develop a nervous system. He thought about that. Is that good? It is significantly better than the alternative, Adase said. On day 4, Petia came with an update from the Chorathi Interaction Office. Signal contact had been established with the nearest Chorathi community, which was designated NHC7 in the Colonial Authority's classification system, and was located approximately 40 kilometers north-northeast of the colony in the Deep Ridge network. The response to the contact had been received and was, Petia's phrase, difficult to interpret. Dr. Haverith says the signal response includes acknowledgement markers and what the interpretation system reads as dismissal indicators, Petia said. He had a way of delivering bad news by surrounding it with bureaucratic language and hoping it would be absorbed rather than felt. The best current interpretation is that NHC7 community is acknowledging that an egg was removed from incubation but is not indicating interest in reclamation. Caleb looked at him for a long moment. They're saying it's not theirs anymore, he said. That may be an oversimplification of Petia. Petia stopped. They left it on a ledge in the cold. Now you're telling me they sent a signal that says, effectively, don't bother us about it. Am I wrong? Petia's jaw moved slightly. The interpretation is not certain, but that's the interpretation. That is the current best interpretation, yes. Caleb looked back at the thermal cradle, where the primary and secondary pulses were doing their slow, layered work. What does the protocol say happens now? Dr. Haverith is researching precedent. There is no clear established precedent. There is a regulatory framework for abandoned Shurathi biological material, but that framework was written with the assumption that the biological material would be material, not living. Petit shifted. There is discussion at the interaction office level about whether the egg might be transferred to the Xenobiological Research Station on Verret Station Prime, where it could be managed under controlled research conditions. No, Caleb said. The interaction office, it needs a consistent thermal environment, a specific cycling pattern, and continuous monitoring. It is not a research specimen. It is a developing organism that has had one bad break already. He paused. I will not send it somewhere to be poked at by people trying to publish papers. Caleb, you can't simply... I can raise the question formally. I can request that the current care arrangements be continued pending further protocol development. Can I do that? Petia looked genuinely unhappy. Technically, yes. Given the absence of clear precedent, the administrator could authorize continuation of current care arrangements on a provisional basis pending interaction office guidance. Then that is what I am going to request. Petia left with the expression of a man who suspected he was going to be writing a great many memos. The administrator, a woman named Councillor Yevgenia Basra, who had been running New Harborview Settlement 7 for 2 years and had the particular combination of competence and exhaustion that distinguished good colonial administrators from bad ones, called Caleb in the next morning. He sat across from her in the prefabricated office that smelled of recycled air and coffee, and she looked at him the way experienced administrators look at people who are about to become problems, not with hostility, but with a kind of professional sorrow. You understand, she said, that you are asking me to authorize something the colonial authority has no clear framework for. Yes, and that the interaction office's preference appears to be relocation. Yes, and that you have no formal standing to care for this organism under any existing protocol. Also yes. She looked at him. Why? Caleb was quiet for a moment. Because I found it. Because it was dying and I had the chance to stop that. Because the community that abandoned it made a mistake based on bad data. And I don't see why that mistake should stand just because nobody wrote a rule about it. He paused. And because my wife died making sure the structure held. And I have been very good at staying busy ever since, and this is something I can do that matters. Yevgenia Basra was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than most silences. I am going to authorize a 90-day provisional care arrangement, she said, subject to Dr. Okonkwo's medical oversight, weekly reporting to Petia for the regulatory record, and immediate compliance with any updated interaction office guidance. Thank you, Caleb. She stopped him as he stood. I want you to be realistic about what may happen. If the Charathi community changes its position, if the interaction office decides on a different approach, if the developmental outcome is not what you're hoping. I'm not hoping for anything specific, he said. I'm just taking care of what's in front of me. She nodded slowly. That is a very frontier answer. I've been here 4 years. I know. She looked at her desk. Go on then. He went. 17 days after Caleb Marsh brought an alien egg down from a rock shelf on the eastern ridge, the shell began to change. The faceted structure, which had been uniform in its membrane pattern, started showing differentiation. Some facets became more opaque, more rigid. Others thinned and became almost translucent, and through them, if the light in the room was right, you could see movement, not dramatic movement, not the kind of movement that announced itself, a slow, purposeful rearranging, the development of limbs in the xenobiological documentation. The early motor development was the right phrasing. Caleb was careful about phrasing because Adize had pointed out, with characteristic precision, that the developmental stages he was observing were not analogous to mammalian development and should not be described in mammalian terms. But the word he used, alone in the side room at 2 in the morning, watching the translucent facets, was not a developmental term. The word he used was alive. The hatching happened on a Tuesday. Caleb would remember this detail for the rest of his life. Not because Tuesdays had any particular significance on Vereth's crossing, but because the mind anchors remarkable things to unremarkable details. It was a Tuesday. He had been eating a rehydrated grain meal that tasted of nothing in particular. The thermal cradle was doing its cycling work. The colony's morning bell had not yet sounded. The sound the shell made when it began to open was not the cracking sound Caleb had subconsciously expected, based on nothing more authoritative than childhood memories of observing birds' eggs. It was a resonant tone, the same fundamental frequency as the bioluminescent vibration, but amplified, distributed across the whole shell surface. Every facet membrane vibrated simultaneously. The sound filled the side room and moved through the walls and was audible faintly in the main medical unit corridor. Adaza arrived at a run, scanner in hand, 6 seconds after the tone began. The shell did not crack. It unfolded. The facets peeled back along precise seam lines, like the petals of a flower opening under time-lapse photography, each one retracting against the curve of its neighbor until the shell had opened itself fully into a flat, many-petaled arrangement on the surface of the thermal cradle. At the center of the arrangement was a Korathi chick. Caleb sat still. The protocols had described the developmental outcome. He had read the descriptions multiple times. He had formed no visual image from them because the guidelines specified no visual descriptions. The early xenobiological documentation had noted that human observers who developed specific visual expectations about Korathi individuals tended to project those expectations in ways that complicated interaction dynamics. So he had not formed a picture. What he knew, because the protocols told him, was that a Korathi chick at the point of emergence would be approximately 30 centimeters in length, would have 4 primary limbs and 2 auxiliary appendages, would be covered in a thin developmental membrane that would dry and slow off over the first hours, would have full auditory development but limited sensory integration, and would be capable of basic locomotor movement. What he had not anticipated was the sound. The chick made a sound the moment it emerged, a single, sustained tone, high and complex, composed of frequencies that stacked over each other in a cascade pattern. It was not a cry in any emotional sense. It was an orientation signal, the protocols had explained, a basic biological broadcast requesting a response from the incubation environment to establish location and thermal context. In a Korathi incubation chamber, the response would come from the surrounding communal space, answering tones from other eggs, from the walls of the chamber, from the attending adults. In the medical unit's side room on Vereth's crossing, the response came from Caleb Marsh, who, without thinking, without planning, without any more preparation than 47 pages of xenobiological protocol, placed his hand flat on the surface of the thermal cradle and hummed. He was not musical. He had never particularly been musical. The hum was low and sustained, and very probably not in any Korathi frequency range. But it was an answer. It was a response. It said in the only way Caleb Marsh had available to him at that moment, "I am here. This is here. You are not alone." The chick's tone shifted. The cascade pattern smoothed and slowed. Adaze, standing in the doorway with her scanner forgotten in her hand, made a sound that she would later categorize as a calibration check on her recording device. Caleb kept humming, the chick oriented toward the vibration. Its auditory receptors, which the protocols described as broad spectrum and highly sensitive at emergence, located the source of the responding tone, and the small body turned slowly, its limbs finding purchase on the flat surfaces of the open shell petals. When it had oriented fully toward Caleb, it went still. In the silence that followed, Caleb heard Adaeze say, very quietly, "Oh." The developmental membrane was already beginning to dry at the edges. The chick's auxiliary appendages, which the protocols described as sensory structures that would develop into signal broadcast organs in maturity, were moving in the slow, questing way of newborn things that have not yet learned what their own body does. Caleb did not move his hand from the cradle. "What do I do?" he said. His voice came out very steady, which surprised him. The protocols specify thermal contact for the first hours, Adaeze said. She had recovered her clinical voice. The chick will need to be maintained at developmental temperature and should have a consistent physical contact point. The thermal cradle surface will serve for initial stabilization, but physical contact with a warm mass, a warm body, will provide better thermal regulation for the first critical hours. Caleb looked at her. That means, Adaeze said carefully, that someone should hold it. The protocols say that? The protocols say thermal mass contact for primary stabilization. The described examples in the Xenobiological Manual involve other Karathi adults. She paused. There are no other Karathi adults available. Caleb reached into the thermal cradle. His hands were large and rough, with the particular roughness of 4 years of frontier work. The kind of calluses that form over calluses. The kind of hands that have learnt the difference between handling things that break and handling things that bend. He moved them with the slowness he used when working with the most delicate components of the water processing unit, the parts that could crack with the wrong amount of pressure. The chick weighed less than he expected. Its body was still warm from the shell, and the developmental membrane was silk soft against his palms, and when he had it cradled in both hands and held close to his chest, which was warm because humans are warm, because mammals are warm, because biology had settled on heat as one of its fundamental strategies for persistence, the chick made a sound, a single low tone, not the orientation cascade, something else, something that the Xenobiological Manual would later describe in the dry language of research documentation as the primary comfort response, a signal broadcast by Chorathi chicks when thermal and physical contact needs were met. Caleb knew what it was before he read that description. He had heard it before, in a different register, from a different kind of small creature, on a different world. He had not held anything like this in. He did not want to count the years, but the body remembered. The arms remembered how to hold something small and trusting, and the chest remembered how to be the warm place where something small came to rest. He sat down on the cot in the side room. The Karathi chick held against him, and the colony's artificial dawn cycle came on outside, and the thermal heaters began their morning ticking, and the sound the frontier makes when it is trying to kill you was, for once, at a distance. Adaeze stood in the doorway for a moment, watching. Then she turned back to the main unit and busied herself with her equipment, because some moments are best observed by not being observed. The question of what to call her was raised by Dominic on the 9th day after hatching. Dominic Chen ran the water processing unit and had been Caleb's friend for 3 years in the specific way that frontier friendships form, not from common interests or temperament, but from proximity, shared difficulty, and the understanding that you would show up when it mattered. He had not asked many questions when Caleb had started borrowing components from the maintenance stores. He asked fewer questions when Caleb's cot relocated to the medical unit. He showed up on the 9th day with a thermos of actual brewed coffee, not the rehydrated powder, actual beans from the colony's grow block, which Dominic guarded with notable ferocity, and looked at the chick who was in the specialized contact carrier that Caleb had constructed from a modified work harness and an insulated mesh layer, nestled against Caleb's chest, while Caleb sat at the workbench reading the protocol updates Dr. Havereth had transmitted. "You haven't named her," Dominic said. "She has a Karathi designation. The Interaction Office assigned a case number and a community tracking identifier. That's not a name." Caleb looked up from the protocols. "I don't know if naming her is appropriate, given the regulatory situation, given that the eventual outcome." "Caleb." Dominic set down the thermos. "She's been sleeping on your chest for 9 days. You already named her. You're just not saying it out loud yet." Caleb was quiet. "What is it?" Dominic said. Another quiet moment. "Kira," Caleb said. Dominic nodded slowly. He did not comment on the name. He understood frontier friendships well enough to know when something was not his to ask about. "Kira," he said. "Good." The name had come to Caleb on day 4, unbidden, while the chick was asleep. He had not planned it. He had not searched for it. It had simply arrived, the way some things arrive when you have stopped looking, with the quiet certainty of something that was always going to be there, waiting. Kira had been Sarah's name for the child they had planned to have, not a promise, not a certainty, a plan, a name held lightly, in the future tense, for something that had not yet existed and now never would. They had talked about it the way they talked about everything that mattered, quietly, practically, as though it were a logistical problem to be solved, rather than a dream. But the name had been there, Kira, with the emphasis on the first syllable, the way Sarah said it, which was different from any other way Caleb had heard the name said. He did not say any of this to Dominic. He did not need to. Kira's development was accelerating. Shorathi chicks, the protocols explained, had compressed early developmental timelines compared to most sapient species, a biological adaptation to the high-risk early period outside the egg, during which the chick was most vulnerable to environmental threats. The motor development that might take months in a mammalian infant took days in a Shorathi chick. The sensory integration was rapid. The signal development, the broadcast and receive structures that were the basis of Shorathi communication, began differentiation within the first week. By day 10, Kira could move independently across a surface, with the somewhat erratic but purposeful locomotion of an organism that was still working out the operational parameters of its own limbs. By day 12, she had discovered that the walls of the side room had different acoustic properties and was systematically investigating each one. By day 15, she had begun producing organized signals, not the simple comfort tones or orientation cascades of the first days, but structured broadcasts with repeating patterns and variable components. Adase ran signal analyses on the structured broadcasts. They were, she reported, consistent with early language acquisition, a Korathi chick beginning to map its signal repertoire against the responses it received, building a communicative model of its environment. What environment is she mapping against? Caleb asked. This room, you, me, the equipment signatures, the sounds from outside the module. Adase paused. Her communication model is being built in the context of this specific environment and the specific response patterns within it, which means she is learning to communicate in a human context. She will develop Shorathi signal structures. The biology is hard-coded and the physical structures will develop regardless, but the social and contextual framework of her communication is being established here. Caleb considered this. Is that a problem? I don't know, Adase said honestly. It may create challenges in future Shorathi communication contexts if and when she has access to them, or it may create a unique bridge capacity. She paused again. There is genuinely no precedent for this. For any of it, Caleb said. No, for any of it. The regulatory situation had not resolved. Patir was filing weekly updates to the Interaction Office. The Interaction Office was producing guidance documents that were thorough, careful, and, in Yevgenia's private assessment, completely unequipped to address what was actually happening in the medical unit's side room. The NHC-7 community had not responded to follow-up signal contact. The Xenobiological Research Station on Verit Station Prime had submitted a formal request for access to the specimen, which Caleb had formally objected to and which Yevgenia had formally deferred pending further administrative review, which was her way of saying, not while I'm the administrator. On day 17, Dr. Havarith transmitted a new document. It was not a protocol update. It was a personal communication, the first one she had sent. It said, I have been following the developmental reports with close attention. I want you to understand that what you are documenting is extraordinary. Not the survival of the egg, though that was unlikely enough. The rate of cognitive and communicative development you are observing in this chick exceeds documented norms by a factor of approximately 40%. I do not have a full explanation for this. The early thermal trauma may have been a factor. There is theoretical literature suggesting that recovery from early developmental stress can, in some organisms, produce accelerated neurological development as a compensatory mechanism, but the social context may also be relevant. There is nothing in the existing xenobiological record about Sharathi development in a human proximate environment. I believe you may be watching something that has never been observed before. Caleb read this 3 times. Then he went back to the side room where Kira was investigating the acoustic properties of an empty equipment case, broadcasting structured signals and listening to the echoes with the complete and unhurried attention of someone learning a great deal very quickly. He sat down on the floor. She noticed him. She oriented toward him. He knew the tilt of the auditory receptors by now, the specific adjustment that meant, "I know you are there." She broadcast a signal. He had learned to identify the primary comfort tone, the orientation cascade, the alarm response, the exploratory broadcast. This one was new. It was short and structured and ended on a rising inflection that was very probably not intentional on her part, but which sounded undeniably like a question. "I'm here," he said. She broadcast the signal again. "I'm here," he said. She moved across the floor toward him, her locomotion more confident now, and climbed onto his knee with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who had decided that this particular surface was for climbing on. She broadcast the short signal once more, then she settled. Caleb sat very still. He thought about the extraordinary, which was just another word for the unexpected, and how the unexpected had a way of landing in your life in the form of a cold and dying thing that needed someone to stop walking past. He thought about what Dr. Havarith had said. He thought about 40%. He thought about a 40% acceleration in cognitive development, because the world she was learning had a specific warm-blooded, warm-handed human being in it, learning her signals back. He put his hand gently on the small, warm weight on his knee. He said, "Okay, Kira, let me tell you about this place." News in a colonial settlement of 800 people moves the way news moves in any small community, faster than the speed of information, slower than the speed of assumption, and in a direction determined more by social current than by fact. The fact was, Caleb Marsh had found an abandoned alien egg, kept it alive, and the egg had hatched, and he was now caring for the infant. The assumption, in its various versions, as it traveled from the medical unit to the water processing facility, to the grow blocks, to the residential modules and back, ranged from "he's gone a bit strange since Sarah died, bless him," to "it's a good deed, leave him alone," to the more complicated position held by about a third of the colony, which was something like, "this is going to cause problems." The third position was not wrong, it was just incomplete. The problems arrived in stages. The first stage was the Interaction Office's formal position paper, transmitted 6 weeks after hatching, which identified the situation as a regulatory anomaly and proposed 3 resolution pathways. The first pathway was transfer to the Xenobiological Research Station. The second was an attempt to reintegrate the infant with a Korathi community, any Korathi community, not necessarily NHC7, under supervised conditions. The third, listed last and without enthusiasm, was continued provisional care under current arrangements pending development of appropriate long-term frameworks. The formal position paper generated a meeting. The meeting involved Yevgenia, Petya, Caleb, Adeze, and a transmission link to Dr. Havarith and 2 Interaction Office officials whose names Caleb immediately forgot because they were the kind of names that belonged to institutional documents rather than to people. The first pathway was raised. Caleb did not raise his voice. He said, very calmly, that Kira, he used the name which generated a microsecond of reaction on the transmission link, was 49 days post-emergence, that her cognitive development was advanced, that she had formed specific social attachments within the care environment, and that disrupting those attachments at this stage would constitute a documented xenobiological harm. He cited the section of Dr. Havarith's own transmitted research that addressed the criticality of early attachment formation in sapient species cognitive development. There was a silence. Dr. Havarith on the link said, he is accurately citing the research. The first pathway was tabled. The second pathway was raised. Dr. Havarith provided the actual data on this. The nearest Sharathi communities that had not abandoned an egg, Communities that might theoretically accept an unfamiliar infant were 40 to 200 kilometers away. The signal exchange required to establish initial contact had proceeded over the past 6 weeks and produced exactly 2 substantive responses, both of which were interpreted as cautious non-commitment. The introduction of a post-hatching infant into a new community, one whose development had proceeded in a human-proximate environment, was, Dr. Haverith said carefully, an outcome with very limited predictive modeling and potentially significant risks to the infant's welfare. Define significant risks, Caleb said. Sharathi community structure is defined by signal networks. An infant whose signal patterns have been shaped by human environmental context will be unusual, potentially incompatible, at least initially, with community signal norms. The response to that incompatibility could range from gradual adaptation to, she paused. The xenobiological literature on anomalous community members in eusocial species is not consistently positive. The second pathway was tabled. The third pathway remained. It was not a resolution, it was an ongoing complication, but it was, for now, what Kira had. The second stage of problems was the colony itself. Specifically, a formal petition signed by 67 colony members, which arrived on Yevgenia's desk 8 weeks after hatching. The petition did not use hostile language. It was carefully worded. It cited regulatory uncertainty, potential impact on shared habitation zone relations with the Korathi communities, the unprecedented nature of the arrangement, and a concern, stated carefully, almost academically, about what it meant for the colony to be informally raising a Korathi infant when the formal diplomatic relationship with Korathi communities was still fragile and incompletely defined. 67 names out of 800. Caleb read the petition. He thought about the remaining 733. He thought about Dominic, who had brought the good coffee. He thought about Farah, who had come to the side room on day 20 with a gift of a small sound-producing mechanism from the maintenance stores that she had recalibrated to produce tones in the Korathi signal range based on a frequency chart she had asked Dr. Haverith to transmit. He thought about the Groblock crew who had started making small batches of the protein paste that the protocols specified for Korathi infant nutrition and leaving them at the medical unit door. No note, no name, just the containers. He thought about the dozen people who had quietly, without announcement, started reading the xenobiological documentation that was publicly filed as part of the regulatory record. He thought about the 67. He went to see Yevgenia. "You've read it," she said. "Yes. What do you want me to say?" "I want you to tell me if it changes anything." She was quiet for a moment. "The petition raises legitimate questions. Some of the signatories are people I take seriously. The concerns about diplomatic implications are not baseless." She looked at him steadily. "But the regulatory situation has not changed. The child, the infant, is in your care under a valid provisional authorization. The petition doesn't change that, but it's going to generate pressure." "Yes, it's going to generate pressure." She paused. "Caleb, I have been an administrator for 14 years. I have been in situations where what is right and what is easy are different things many times. This is one of those situations. I intend to do what is right." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to be visible, not aggressive, not defensive, visible. The colony needs to see this clearly, not through the distortion of rumor. They need to understand what this actually is. And what is this?" She looked at him for a long moment. A child who was thrown away, and a person who refused to walk past. He nodded slowly. That week he began spending time outside the medical unit. With Kira in the modified carrier against his chest, he walked the colony's internal paths, the covered walkways between modules, the communal spaces in the central hub, the area near the grow blocks where people gathered in the mornings with their rehydrated coffee, and the few actual brewed cups that Dominic dispensed like a sacrament. He did not make speeches. He did not hand out documentation. He simply was there, visibly with Kira, doing what he had been doing for weeks, responding when she broadcast, listening, talking to her in the easy, constant way that people talk to infants, narrating the world, because the world needs narration, because to know a thing you must name it. This is the water processor. That sound is the morning bell. The cold you feel is the air coming through the intake. That person is Dominic. That person is Farah. That person. He stopped on one morning walk beside a man named Keir, who had signed the petition. Keir was a structural engineer. Caleb had worked beside him on 3 projects. They were not friends, but they were colleagues, which on the frontier was nearly the same thing. Keir looked at Kira, who had oriented toward him and was broadcasting the exploratory signal, the one that meant new input, processing, mapping it into the model. "She can hear me," Keir said. "She has very good hearing, better than ours. How does she hear us? We're not in her frequency range, are we? We're in her lower reception range. She hears us differently from how she hears her own signals, but she hears us." Caleb paused. "She's been listening to this colony since she emerged. She knows this place." Keir was quiet for a moment. Is she okay? She looks..." He stopped. "Sorry, that's probably not the right question." "She's doing very well," Caleb said. "She's in the 95th percentile for developmental progress according to the xenobiological protocols." "Because of how you're raising her?" Caleb thought about this. "Because she's learning in an environment that's engaged with her, people who respond to her, who pay attention. That's true for most young things." Keir looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the floor. "I signed the petition," he said. "I know. It wasn't about her. I want you to know that. It was about the diplomatic situation. I didn't want the colony to have problems because of..." "I know," Caleb said. "I read the petition. You can care about 2 things at once." Keir was quiet. "I'm not angry," Caleb said. "Complicated situations produce disagreement. That's how communities work." He paused. "I think the diplomatic situation is best served by raising her well and letting people see that. But I understand that's an argument, not a fact." Keir nodded slowly. Kira broadcast a signal, short, structured, the rising inflection at the end. "She's asking you something," Caleb said. "I can't tell you what, because I don't speak Charathi. But she does this with everything new. She wants to know what it is." Keir looked at the small figure in the carrier. He said, very carefully, as though the words needed to be precise, "I'm Keir. I'm a structural engineer. I helped build this place." Kira broadcast again. "She won't understand the words," Caleb said, "but she'll map the frequency pattern of your voice. She's filing you." "Filing me," Keir said. "That's how she learns, builds a model of everything in her world." He paused. "She'll remember you." Keir stood with this information for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I might need to amend the petition." Months passed. This is the part of any story that is hardest to tell, because it is where the real work happens, and real work resists narration. Real work is incremental. It is waking up at the same time, eating the same inadequate food, walking the same paths, doing the same repetitive things that need to be done. It is the thermal cradle cycling through the night. It is the protocols reviewed and revised. It is the grow block crew's protein paste deliveries becoming a standing arrangement, formalized now, acknowledged and appreciated. It is Dominic's coffee becoming a weekly ritual, Tuesday mornings, the good beans, Caleb at the workbench, and Kira investigating whatever new object had been introduced to the side room. It is Farah's sound-producing mechanism becoming the first thing Kira sought when she was distressed, which made Farah, who would have denied this to her last breath, cry once, quietly, in the medical unit corridor when she thought no one was watching. Real work is Kira standing independently for the first time on a cold morning in month 3, her limbs finding their balance, with the absolute concentration of a creature that has decided it is time to do a new thing and is applying everything it has to the task. It is Kira's signal repertoire expanding past the protocol's expected range, developing complexity and specificity that Dr. Haverith documented with increasing excitement and transmitted back in research notes that grew longer every month. It is Caleb learning, slowly, imperfectly, incompletely, how to read what Kira was broadcasting. Not to translate, that was not possible, not without years of formal xenolinguistic study that he did not have, but to understand in the way you understand music without knowing music theory, or weather without knowing meteorology, pattern recognition, emotional register. The difference between the signal that means I am curious and the signal that means I am uncertain and the signal that means something is wrong. The signal that meant he was there, which Kira broadcast specifically for him and no one else, shorter and lower than her other comfort signals, with a specific cadence he could not have described in phonetic terms, but would have recognized in a seismic field at 300 meters. It is the colony shifting around them the way soil shifts around a root, slowly, imperceptibly, and then all at once. The 67 became 40, then 30, then, effectively, 12. 12 people who maintained formal reservation about the arrangement, who were not hostile, but who had not been persuaded, who existed as a reminder that consensus in a colony is not a destination, but a direction. The rest of the colony found its own relationship with Kira, idiosyncratic and human, and therefore incalculably varied. There was the 3-year-old daughter of one of the grow block technicians who approached Kira with the complete absence of social hesitation that very young children demonstrate around everything they haven't been taught to fear, and who became, after several weeks of parallel play in the communal hub's open space, something that functioned as a friend, not in the way that adults make friends, but in the wordless, presence-based way that small creatures forge bonds across difference. They played with the same objects. They occupied the same space. They built, through weeks of proximity, the particular understanding that only comes from just being next to something long enough. There was the colony's elderly head grower, a man named Vasil, who had strong opinions about root vegetables and very few opinions about anything else, who discovered that Kira was curious about the smell of the grow block soil, and who thereafter permitted her a weekly visit to run the surface sensors along the grow beds, which she clearly found intensely interesting. Vasil took this in stride. He had grown things for 40 years and understood that curiosity in a young thing was something to be encouraged rather than managed. There was the Children's Learning Circle, 4 families who shared educational responsibilities, who added xenobiological documentation about Charathi biology and culture to their curriculum material, and who invited Caleb to speak once about what he knew. He was not a scientist. He was not an expert. He was a man who had spent 9 months learning one specific Charathi individual with all the attention he had available. He spoke for an hour and then answered questions for another hour, and the children asked the kind of questions that only children ask, not the diplomatic or regulatory questions, not the political or cultural questions, but the direct ones. Does she dream? How do you know when she's happy? Does she know you're not the same as her? That last question was from a 9-year-old named Pavi, who asked it with the perfect, unself-conscious directness of someone who had not yet learned to be indirect. Caleb thought about it for a moment. She knows, he said. She's known from the beginning. She can tell the difference between her own signals and the signals this environment produces. She knows I'm different. Then why does she stay with you? Pavi asked. Another moment, because knowing someone is different from you isn't the same as not knowing them, Caleb said. You can know exactly what someone is and still know that they care about you. She knows what I am. She also knows that I was there when she needed someone to be there. He paused. That's usually enough. Pavi thought about this with the seriousness that 9-year-olds bring to genuinely interesting problems. Then she nodded, as though this had been confirmed against an internal standard she maintained. Okay, she said. In month 7, Dr. Haverith requested a direct communication link, not a data transfer session, but an actual conversation with Caleb and Adeze and, if possible, Kira in the room. Kira was in the room. She was in the carrier, which she tolerated now with the specific resignation of someone who understood why a thing was necessary, even if they found it constraining. She was 11 months old by emergence date. She was, Dr. Havrith said, when she saw the setup, larger than she had expected. The growth rate is consistent with the accelerated development you've been documenting, Dr. Havrith said, but the physical scale, it's more visible than I had accounted for. She's going to be significantly larger than standard Sharathi developmental norms for her age cohort. Is that a problem? It's a data point I don't have good context for. She paused. I want to ask you something directly, Caleb. I want you to think about the answer before you give it. All right. How is she? Not developmentally, not as a research subject. How is she? The question landed differently from how he had expected. He sat with it for a moment. She's good, he said. She's not having a hard time. She's curious and engaged, and she has things she cares about, and she gets frustrated when she doesn't understand something, and she broadcasts what I've come to think of as laughter when Dominic does the thing where he pretends to spill his coffee. She's anticipating it now. She knows it's coming, but she still broadcasts the laughter signal. He paused. She's not unhappy. If she were unhappy, I'd know. Dr. Havrith was quiet for a moment. I ask, she said, because I have been in correspondence with 2 xenobiologists who specialize in hybrid social development in sapient species. The specific circumstances here, a Korathi individual raised in human proximate community contexts, have not been observed before. The theoretical frameworks are incomplete. There are researchers who believe this will create developmental fractures that will become more significant as she matures. There are others who believe the adaptability demonstrated by sapient species in cross-cultural developmental contexts suggests she will find equilibrium. A pause. I am in the second camp. I want you to know that. I appreciate it, but I want you to be prepared for the possibility that as she matures, there will be questions about her identity, her place between 2 communities that she belongs to partially, but perhaps not completely. That is not a regulatory question. That is a question about who she is and who she will become. Those questions will need to be navigated. I know, Caleb said. Kira broadcast a signal, short, structured. The question inflection, I know, he said again to her this time. She broadcast again, a different signal, lower, with the specific cadence that meant him. He reached into the carrier and let her take his hand in both of her smaller ones. She held it with the firmness of a creature that had learned what hands were for holding on. Dr. Havrith, on the transmission link, said nothing for a moment. Then she said, I will continue to support the current arrangements in my communications with the Interaction Office. I want that on record. Thank you. Don't thank me, do the work. I always do, Caleb said. The crisis arrived on a clear night, which was unusual enough on Vareth's crossing that people noted it. The overcast that defined the planet's perpetual sky had broken in the late afternoon, as it did perhaps a dozen times a year, revealing the star field above in the particular clarity that comes when the atmosphere has been washed by the ridge winds. People stepped outside to look. Children were brought out to see the stars. Vasil, who had seen the sky clear many times, went out anyway, because the sky's intermittent clarity was one of the things he had come to value about this world. Caleb was in the central hub with Kira when the emergency channel activated. Pettia's voice, all senior personnel to the operations center, emergency interaction office contact, priority 1. Kira felt the change in him. She broadcast the uncertainty signal, the one that meant something is wrong, confirm. He pressed a hand to the carrier and said, quietly, come on, and walked fast through the hub to the operations center. The operations center's main display was active. On the transmission link were 2 people Caleb did not recognize from the interaction office, and Dr. Havrith, and a man from the Korathi Liaison Bureau in the Colonial Authority's central office, a man with the specific expression of someone delivering news they do not entirely understand but know is significant. We have received a direct signal transmission from NHC-7, the liaison man said. This is the first direct signal contact NHC-7 has initiated since the abandonment event was logged. The signal has been analyzed by our best interpretation systems and manually reviewed by Dr. Haverith. Dr. Haverith looked, for the first time in Caleb's experience of her, as though she was not sure how to proceed. "The transmission is complex," she said. "I want to give you the best interpretation I can, but I want to be clear that signal interpretation has inherent uncertainty margins." "Tell me," Caleb said. "NHC-7 has been monitoring Kira's signal broadcasts since emergence. The community's signal network has passive receptors across a significant radius. They have been observing her developmental signal output without engaging with it." She paused. "The signal transmission we received tonight is a recognition transmission. NHC-7 is identifying Kira as belonging to their community lineage." The room was very quiet. "They're claiming her," Caleb said. "That's one interpretation." Dr. Haverith was careful. The recognition transmission in Chorathi's signal protocol typically precedes reintegration overtures. It is an acknowledgement of biological community ties. "They abandoned her," Adaya said from the back of the room. Her voice was very controlled. "They assessed her as non-viable. That assessment was incorrect." Dr. Haverith paused. "The transmission also contains what the interpretation system reads as developmental assessment signals, as though NHC-7 has been evaluating her broadcast patterns and revising their original non-viability determination." She paused again, longer this time. "Her signal complexity and developmental advancement appear to have captured their attention, and now they want her back," Yevgenia said. "The transmission does not explicitly specify. It is a recognition signal. What follows from recognition in Chorathi protocol is not entirely mapped." The liaison man from the colonial authority spoke. "The authority's position is that the shared habitation zone regulations require engagement with any direct Chorathi community communication. Recognition of community ties, even in this unusual context, may constitute a claim that the authority has an obligation to address." Caleb stood very still. Kira, in the carrier, was broadcasting, not the uncertainty signal, something Caleb had never heard before. A signal he did not have in his model, low, sustained, complex, with a repeating element that seemed to be varying slightly each repetition, as though she was working through something. "Is she responding to this?" he said. "Can she hear the transmission?" Dr. Haverith's eyes widened slightly. "The signal we received was on the standard authority communication channel, but she leaned forward. She heard it. Her frequency range includes the carrier frequencies we use for standard transmission. She didn't hear our interpretation of it. She heard the original signal." "What is she broadcasting right now?" A moment while Dr. Haverith analyzed. Her expression shifted. That's an identity signal, a self-identification broadcast. She's responding to NHC-7's recognition with her own recognition. She's acknowledging the signal." The room was very quiet in a different way now. "She knows them," Caleb said. "She knows their signal signature. She's been hearing their passive monitoring for months, apparently, even if she didn't know what it was. The recognition signal used elements she was already mapping." Dr. Haverith looked at Caleb directly. "Caleb, I need to tell you something that is not in the current protocols because it is based on research that was published 3 weeks ago, and I have not yet had time to transmit the full documentation." "Tell me." "There is a new body of research on Chorathi developmental neurology, specifically on the signal mapping that occurs in the first year. The research demonstrates that in the first 12 months, a Chorathi individual forms what the authors call a community signal anchor, a set of signal patterns that are neurologically mapped as foundational, as home. These patterns shape all subsequent social development." She stopped. Kira's community signal anchor was formed here. The patterns she has anchored to are the signal environment of this colony, the signal environment that includes you, Adiza, Dominic, Farah, the Groblock crew, Pavi, Vasil. "Everyone here," Caleb said. "Everyone here. NHC-7's recognition signal is being incorporated by her into a secondary map. She recognizes it as biologically related. She does not anchor to it. She does not anchor to NHC7. Dr. Havereth paused. She anchors here. Caleb let out a breath. The liaison man from the colonial authority cleared his throat. This is valuable context, but it does not resolve the regulatory question. The recognition transmission represents a community claim. Does it? Yevgenia said. She had the tone she used when she had made a decision. Dr. Havereth, in Kurathi protocol, what is the significance of the community signal anchor in determinations of community membership? Dr. Havereth looked at Yevgenia with something that might have been appreciation. In Kurathi social structure, community membership is defined by signal relationship, not biological origin. The community signal anchor is the foundational membership indicator, a community claim based on biological lineage. In the absence of anchor signal correspondence, would be, she paused, unprecedented. Kurathi communities don't typically need to make that distinction. The scenario has never arisen before. So it has never arisen before, Yevgenia said, which means there is no established protocol giving precedence to a biological claim over an anchor signal claim. The liaison man looked uncomfortable. I am going to respond to NHC7's transmission, Yevgenia said. I am going to acknowledge the recognition signal and request further contact to establish a formal diplomatic dialogue. I am going to do this within the framework of the Shared Habitation Zone protocols, which give the colony administrator authority to manage direct Chorathi contact, pending authority guidance. She looked at the liaison man steadily. I am not going to make any commitments about Kira's placement until Dr. Havereth's research is formally incorporated into the protocol framework and the question of community claim versus anchor signal is resolved through proper process. The authority can issue guidance. It cannot make operational decisions for this settlement. That is what the administrative charter says, and I am the administrator. She paused. I suggest the authority move quickly on the protocol question. We will cooperate fully with that process. Another pause. We will not cooperate with any attempt to remove a child in contravention of documented developmental best practices and documented community anchor evidence from the environment in which she has formed her foundational social bonds. The liaison man looked at his notes. He looked at the screen. He looked at two people who had already made up their minds. He said, I will convey the settlement's position to the authority. The signal exchange with NHC7 took 3 weeks to reach a form that Dr. Havereth was willing to describe as substantive. Chorathi signal communication was not designed for the regulatory timelines of colonial bureaucracy. It moved at the pace of a community in genuine deliberation, slowly, thoroughly, with the kind of communal consideration that did not prioritize resolution over accuracy. Dr. Havereth translated and interpreted. Petter filed everything, because Petter filed everything, and Caleb was grateful for it. Yevgenia held the administrative position. The colonial authority, faced with the new research documentation, the absence of precedent, and the specific and documented facts of the case, moved with the particular speed of large institutions when they are trying to avoid setting a precedent they are not prepared for, which is to say, slowly and with great care. What emerged, after 3 weeks of signal exchange, was not a resolution. It was something more complicated and more interesting. NHC7 was not, it turned out, trying to reclaim Kira in any simple sense. The community had been monitoring her signal development for months, and what they had been observing was something their community signal interpretation framework had no category for. A Kurathi individual whose signal complexity exceeded developmental norms, who broadcast patterns consistent with what the Kurathi community would recognize as high signal development, cognitive richness, communicative depth, but who was doing so in a context of human proximate environmental anchoring. They had not made a mistake, Caleb came to understand, in the sense of being malicious or careless. They had made a measurement error. The egg's signals in the cold of the ledge shelf had fallen below the threshold the community used to assess developmental viability. The threshold was not arbitrary. It was a survival-adapted response to real resource constraints in the communal incubation space. But in this case, the measurement and the reality had diverged. NHC-7 was grappling with that. The recognition signal had not been a claim. It had been, Dr. Havereth eventually concluded after weeks of analysis, something closer to an acknowledgement of responsibility, an admission expressed in the only way Chorathi communities expressed such things, through signal protocol, that an error had been made and that the community was aware of it. This did not make the situation simple, but it made it navigable. What was proposed in the imprecise working hypothesis way that genuinely new diplomatic situations generate their first approaches was a relationship rather than a resolution. NHC-7 and New Harborview Settlement 7, through the mediation of Dr. Havereth and the patient administrative work of Yevgenia, would establish a communication channel. Kira would have access to Chorathi signal education, the structured broadcast learning that Chorathi communities normally provided through communal immersion, offered instead through a dedicated signal relay that the Interaction Office would establish at the colony's perimeter. She would not be removed. She would not be reintegrated into NHC-7. She would be, in the words Dr. Havereth eventually found, a bridge individual. Someone whose community anchor was in one place, and whose biological heritage was in another, and whose life would be shaped by that particular double belonging. It was not a tidy answer. Caleb did not expect tidy answers. He expected work. The colonial authority issued a guidance document 12 weeks after the initial recognition transmission. The document was, in Yevgenia's assessment, the product of genuine effort to understand a situation for which no framework had existed. It acknowledged the precedent-setting nature of the case. It incorporated Dr. Havereth's research on community signal anchors. It established, for the first time in colonial authority regulatory history, a category of anchor-established community membership in shared habitation zone contexts that was distinct from biological community membership. Patir, who had been filing reports for 5 months, read the guidance document and said, with the exhausted satisfaction of a man who had spent considerable energy on a correct position, "We were right, we were right," Yevgenia agreed. Caleb was not in the meeting when the guidance document arrived. He was on the Eastern Ridge path, which he still walked most mornings, with Kira beside him now. Walking beside him, her locomotion confident and sure on the rocky surface, her auditory receptors taking in the wind sounds, the mineral smell of the rock, the distant sounds of the colony waking up. She was 1 year and 4 months old. She was, by any developmental measure, extraordinary. She was also, by the measure Caleb trusted most, the measure of watching a small thing engage with its world with confidence and curiosity, and the particular kind of courage that comes from knowing you are not alone, simply herself, exactly what she was. She broadcast the question signal. "The ridge," he said. "We're on the Eastern Ridge. We come here most mornings because it's the place I know best. Your mother, Sarah, she never got to walk this path. I used to walk it and think about that." He paused. "Now I walk it and think about you." She broadcast again, lower this time. The signal that meant him. "I know," he said. "I'm here." She moved ahead of him on the path, broadcasting the exploratory signal to the rock walls as she walked, listening to the echoes come back in the particular way they did in the morning light. She had been doing this for 3 months. She was building a map, not a visual map, but a signal map of the ridge, the way the stone held sound, the way the wind's frequencies shifted through the channels, the signature of the place. She was learning the ridge the way Caleb had learnt it. By putting her hand, her signal, against it and paying attention, he watched her. He thought about the 47 pages of xenobiological protocol that he had read 3 times in a single night. He thought about the thermal cradle, the heating element, the timing relay he had built from a circuit kit. He thought about Adeza's clinical voice saying stable, and Dominic's thermos of actual coffee, and Farah's sound-producing mechanism, and Vasil's grow bed visits, and Pavi asking, "Does she know you're not the same as her?" He thought about Sarah. Not with the grief that used to arrive like a change in atmospheric pressure, a whole body low, but with something that had more of pride in it and more of peace. Sarah had been the dreamer of the two of them. Caleb had been the one who knew how to weld. He thought that maybe the distinctions between dreaming and building were less clear than he had always assumed. Maybe the act of going back to the same ridge path on the same cold morning for 4 years, putting your hand against the same rock, refusing to stop reaching towards something larger than yourself, maybe that was a form of dreaming too, not the kind that generated plans, the kind that generated patience. And patience, in the end, was what the frontier ran on. Kira had reached the section of the path that widened, where the rock pulled back from the edge and the view of the basin opened fully. She stood there, her auditory receptors oriented outward, broadcasting signals that rang off the ridgeline and came back altered by distance and stone. She was not exploring now. She was not building her map. She was doing something Caleb had no word for, broadcasting not to receive information, but simply to fill the space, to say, "I am here," to the empty rock and the distant basin and the faint greenish light of a far star. He stood beside her. He put his hand against the rock. The rock exhaled. Kira broadcast the signal that meant him. He did not hum this time. He did not need to. He just stood there, solid and warm in the cold morning, on the ridge of a planet that had spent 4 years trying to teach him something, beside a small and extraordinary person who had been decided against before she had the chance to be known. "I've got you," he said. The wind moved through the rock channels. The colony's morning bell sounded, distant and clear. The day began. 3 years later, a researcher from the Institute of Xenosocial Studies at Meridian University published a paper in the Colonial Authorities Scientific Journal. The paper was 42 pages long and had 47 co-authors, which was a measure of how thoroughly a single small life on a frontier world had redirected a field of study. The paper was titled "Community Anchor Formation in Cross-Species Developmental Contexts: Evidence from the Vereth's Crossing Case." It was widely read, it was widely cited, it generated 2 conferences, 6 dissertations, and a substantial revision of the Colonial Authorities' Shared Habitation Zone framework, a framework revision that was, for once, not a bureaucratic exercise but a genuine attempt to account for something that had been observed and could no longer be ignored. The paper described, in careful scientific language, what 47 pages of xenobiological protocol had not quite prepared Caleb Marsh for. It described the way a young Kirathi individual in human proximate developmental context had formed social bonds of unusual depth and stability. It described the signal complexity that had emerged from that context. It described the specific neurological mechanisms by which community anchoring occurred in the critical first year and what the implications were for sapient social development across species lines. And in its conclusion, the paper said this: "The Vereth's crossing case demonstrates that the conditions under which early social bonds form, the warmth, the responsiveness, the consistent presence of an engaged caregiver, are not species-specific requirements. They are requirements of development itself. The substrate through which warmth is communicated, whether signal broadcast or spoken word, whether Kirathi frequency range or the lower registers of a human voice, is secondary to the fundamental biological need, the need to know that when you reach out, something reaches back." Caleb read the paper on a Tuesday morning, drinking actual coffee because Dominic had expanded the Growblock's bean production and the good coffee was no longer a scarcity. Kira was at the perimeter relay station for her weekly signal education session, a session she approached with the intense focus she applied to everything and from which she returned full of new broadcast patterns that she would spend the next several days integrating into her existing repertoire, producing effects that Dr. Haverith continued to describe as extraordinary and that Caleb continued to describe simply as Kira. She was 4.5 years old. She was taller than expected. She was, by the assessment of every developmental specialist who had reviewed her case, one of the most cognitively advanced Kirathi individuals in the documented record, which the paper attributed to the environmental stimulation and social richness of her developmental context. She had friends. She had Pavi, who was 12 now and who had become, in the way that a 9-year-old's simple acceptance sometimes becomes something load-bearing, a kind of steadiness that Kira returned to when the complexity of her doubled identity became heavy. She had the Growblock crew, whose protein paste deliveries had become a standing joke and a genuine tradition and a way of saying "you are ours." She had Vasil's grow beds and Dominic's coffee rituals and Farah's maintenance store gifts, which had expanded from sound-producing mechanisms to a menagerie of small salvaged objects that Farah presented with the casual air of someone who was absolutely not making an effort. She had NHC-7 on a signal relay 3 kilometers from the colony perimeter. A community that had, over 3 years of signal exchange, arrived at something that was not simple reconciliation, but was genuine and growing. A relationship with the individual they had released, and who had, in being released, become something that changed the way they understood their own community. The relationship was managed with care and conducted through signal protocol and mediated by Dr. Haverith. And it was in the nature of such things, not without difficulty, not without the weight of what had happened, but also not without the possibility of something better than what had been. She had the colony, all of it, including the 12 who had not been persuaded quickly, most of whom had been persuaded eventually, through the particular persuasive power of a child growing up in your community and being simply and undeniably herself. And she had Caleb. This was the thing the paper did not quite capture. For all its 42 pages and 47 authors, it captured the neurology and the signal architecture and the developmental metrics. It did not capture the Eastern Ridge at dawn. It did not capture the way a man who knew how to weld learned, over 4 years of paying close attention, to read the specific cadence of a signal that had no word in any human language but that translated approximately as, "You are the place I come from." He set the paper down. He heard the door of the medical unit. Kira's habit was still to enter through the medical unit on the way home from the relay station, which Adaise tolerated with fond exasperation, and he heard the sound of a small broadcast, exploratory, announcing arrival. "In here," he called. She came through the inner door and stood in the side room's doorway. The side room that had once held a thermal cradle and a cot and 47 pages of protocol, and now held a workbench and 2 chairs and a growing collection of small objects that served no purpose except to have been given or found and kept. She broadcast the signal that meant him. "How was it?" he said. She broadcast a long, complex sequence, which meant good and many things, and I have much to tell you, and also I'm hungry, in whatever proportion those things were combined on a particular afternoon. "I have the paste," he said, standing, "and Dominic sent actual coffee. Come on." She crossed the room to him with the ease of someone who had been crossing this room since she could walk. She broadcast the shorter signal, lower, specific. He put his hand on her back, warm and solid. "I've got you," he said. She broadcast her signal back, the one that meant him, the one that meant home. They went to the kitchen together, in the late afternoon light of a world that was still learning to be generous, and the day continued around them like a place that had decided, finally, to keep them both.